What it do, man? Y'all know who it is, man. This is the second premiere today, man. I'm coming with part 2 to AIDS Exposed. We're gonna go ahead and let that run.
And AIDS were distinct, separate entities, and that AIDS was diverting my attention from the real culprit, HIV. Where to next? The place millions have had their lives changed forever.
She says, we have your test result, you need to come in and get it. And I was like, tell me now, Cheryl. She was like, Kim, we really need you to come in and tell me. I said, then I know it's positive, Cheryl, or you would just tell me over the phone. And she's like, Kim, don't panic. You can still have a normal life.
I can still remember his face. I can remember his eyes. And all he said was, I'm so sorry. I think you should put your affairs in order, and you might have 5 years.
I said, Cheryl, I have to get off the phone right now. I have to go tell my dad. He started crying. This isn't the way it happens in the movies.
It's 7 a.m. here in Johannesburg, South Africa, and I'm a little nervous because I'm about to go in for my first HIV test. Have you ever gone in for an HIV test?
No.
No.
Yes, I have actually, a few years ago.
Were you nervous, apprehensive?
I was very frightened.
The nearest testing center wasn't in a hospital or in a doctor's office, but on the main concourse of a bustling train station, beneath a few portable tents. HIV testing facilities are everywhere, from street corner kiosks to shopping malls. I'll be tested with a rapid test, which looks for antibodies to HIV.
So, have you ever tested for HIV before?
No.
No. It's
Never.
your first time.
First time.
Wow.
Is this your questionnaire?
Yes.
These tests claim to be HIV tests. I'm going to read from a section that says limitations of the test. The specificity of the Reveal Rapid HIV Antibody Test for blood specimens in low-risk populations has not been evaluated. They don't know, in their terms even, how well this test is going to work in people they don't want it to work in. Low risk. We don't think you're at risk.
Tell me about your sex life.
My sex life.
Us? Since you haven't exposed yourself, blood, sex, you're not homosexual, you're gay, you know your story.
Yes.
Let's go and find out.
In 1990, we flew to Romania to adopt a baby. We found Lindsay, and she was only 2 weeks old. I can still remember that feeling, just holding Lindsay for the first time, thinking, now my dream is going to come true. I'll have one of those children. Before we left Romania, we had to make sure that she didn't have HIV. We had to find a doctor, and he did the test, and it came back negative. We flew home just after Christmas, 1990, and I thought we had it made.
So I'm going to do a test which comprises of 2 test kits. These 2 test kits are from 2 different countries. Why you are putting them being 2, you want them to confirm each other. Can they be 2 different outcomes? Then this one has a terminal which is going to give us the final results.
Can I just ask you something, as someone who's a little nervous?
Okay.
It seems like if this is positive and this is negative, my life hangs in the balance on whatever this one is.
Yes.
But how do we know that this one's accurate when both of these were inaccurate?
This one has been tested to be the one that is going to take out the results that are correct.
Oh, so this one is more accurate than these 2?
Yes, according to what we have learned.
So why don't we just use the more accurate one to begin with?
Well, you know what? What if now the more accurate one has a discrepancy? How are you going to find out?
I don't know.
Rapid tests in Germany, it's not allowed for standard diagnostics.
May I ask how come you don't use rapid tests for standard diagnostics?
Several professional organizations who decide as an expert committee on guidelines how to do things. None of these responsible societies recommended for scientific reasons.
We always say to our clients, even if you have tested here, you can go to other centers and go and test and verify your test. You cannot say we're 100% because you find clients going from area to area doing tests. And they come with stories that I was negative at a certain area, I'm positive with you.
How do they decide whether they're positive or negative?
We cannot tell because we are using a rapid test.
It occurred to me that perhaps the HIV epidemic is reported to be so widespread in South Africa and other poor nations simply because they use these inaccurate tests.
There's the saying that if you knew how what sausages are made of, most people would hesitate to sort of.
Now look, yet again, I'm gonna have to bring you into a similarity here, right? With Cavassier, it said that the test kits are not accurate, right? Same thing we got here with AIDS when it first came out. Y'all gotta understand, man. When the CDC runs out of funds, it's always good to hype up the next pandemic, right? But I'm not saying that now AIDS was real. AIDS was really killing people. You know what I'm saying? They took studies off what they did with AIDS and then came back with this Cavassier, and they scaring the shit at you once again. And once again, it's on. You know what I'm saying? They just shut down a lot of stuff. They done killed a lot of jobs that was here at the beginning of the year. Like I said, man, when 2020 was starting out and this and that, man, like towards the end, I started balling. I was doing good. You know what I'm saying? But we still gonna get back to that point. But still yet, you know what I'm saying? Like, they had to kill that economy. And that's what they doing right now. And in the process, getting more money for the CDC so that they can fund the next virus that they're gonna put out here.
Eat them because they wouldn't like what's in it. And if you knew how HIV/AIDS numbers are cooked or made up, you would use them with extreme caution.
I decided to investigate HIV testing protocols used throughout the developed world.
When we're testing people for HIV, the first thing we do is a screening test, and it's usually a test called the ELISA.
But there are also now available rapid assays that can be used as screening methods.
Because they're faster. And we all know faster and cheaper is more efficient.
If an ELISA is positive, it does not mean that the patient is HIV positive. That's a problem.
If we're using antibodies as a screening test to tell who's infected or not, very occasionally you can get false positives.
So screening tests by themselves should not be used as a definitive measure of infection. That's why we use a screening test to pick up all the cases, but we use it to eliminate any false positives.
Take it easy. I'll just get the site.
It should be emphasized that most of the developing world uses only screening tests to confirm an HIV diagnosis. There are no confirmatory tests.
Time now is 25 past. At 22, the results will be out, which is going to be 15 minutes.
9 days after returning home, Steve and Cheryl's pediatrician ran a battery of tests on Lindsay, including an HIV test, even though Lindsay had tested negative for the virus in Romania.
Dr. McHugh called us and said, we run into some problems with the testing that you did at Methodist Hospital, and you'll need to come right in and see me.
I said, well, what is it? She says, well, I'm not going to tell you over the phone. I said, I need to know exactly what this is. He said, you got bad news that she tests positive.
And he said she'll have a 20% chance of living to age 2. It was just a shock. Just a shock after all this joy and happiness. We finally found our daughter, and I'm dancing around Romania, and now I come home, and it's like somebody could just stab me. And then I had to call my mom, and that was the worst phone call I've ever had to make, because I even remember saying, that poor girl, she's just not going to make it.
So that we don't have to go to somebody and say, well, you might be infected, but it might be a false positive. We do a second test. That's a test usually called the Western blot.
In 1992, when I was told by my doctor that I was HIV positive, that was only a verbal admission to me. She didn't give me the written paper that came from the lab that tested my blood. I found out that it says this indicates possible infection by virus.
There can be mistakes from the antibody test, and there are conditions that can cause the test to be inaccurate.
Now that I've got the package insert for that test kit, it says positive results using any specimen type should be followed with additional testing. But this is the test that they use to confirm with.
This has a margin of error done properly that's extremely low. In other words, it's one of medicine's better tests.
I don't think the Western blot is a useful diagnostic test. I don't think it's worth doing.
Did he give a reason? You know, anybody can say anything. I think it's stupid to drive a car. But come on, you gotta give a reason.
It's a useful prognostic test. Once you know that someone is infected, then you can follow their antibody response as well with Western blots.
I'd say he's absolutely wrong. It has a complete usefulness.
You don't need a Western blot. And it's become a dogma in HIV research that you need one ELISA followed by a Western. You don't. You need two different kinds of ELISAs made in two different formats.
Would you ever want to confirm somebody is positive using just ELISAs?
No, never. It's against the rules. It's against the recommendations.
It's a turbulent sea of argument about how can we use this test, when can we use this test, why does this test have no standard?
We have a group now of about 40 patients that have no detectable virus in their body, but they're not being treated. So the first question is, are they really infected?
So the Western blots can have false positives?
No, the Western blot was negative too. But they were told they were positive by a lab, yes, that misread the Western blot.
Heavyweight champion Tommy Morrison tested positive in 1996. 11 years later, in 2007, he tested negative multiple times, allowing him to return to the ring.
There's constant discussion in the community of people who do diagnostic testing and the blood bankers about how to read these tests.
When you're looking at this Western blot, how do you determine what is a positive?
You need a certain number of bands being present. It depends a little bit on the producer of the test.
It depends on the manufacturer. Is there different criteria for what might be a positive?
Yeah, there are different criteria from the manufacturer. Thank you for the word. And also there are guidelines from the WHO and UNAIDS.
Well, HIV infection is diagnosed with rather now routine laboratory tests, which for which there are criteria for diagnosis established by the manufacturer, FDA.
Claudia showed me the package insert that comes with the Western blot. It contains 8 different sets of criteria for diagnosing HIV infection.
Because of the different criteria that apply in different countries, you can test HIV positive in one country and be given an AIDS diagnosis as a result of that, whereas in another country you won't test HIV positive and you won't be given an AIDS diagnosis.
It's ludicrous that you can be positive in one country and not positive in another.
Theoretically, I could be diagnosed with AIDS in the United States, but if I take 3 steps to my right, I wouldn't be diagnosed with AIDS, or I would lose my AIDS diagnosis when I cross the border. In 1992, I wouldn't be diagnosed with AIDS, or I would lose my AIDS diagnosis when I cross the border. In 1992, I was encouraged by a doctor to take what's called an HIV test as a matter of social responsibility, and I was shocked and devastated and horrified when the results came back positive. It was one of those moments that everyone fears their whole life. A week later, I take the same test to an AIDS specialist. He looks and says, "This isn't a positive test. I don't know what this test means." Since a false positive looks like a true positive, how can you ever distinguish whether it's truly a positive or a negative?
Well, that's a great question.
It's going to be very hard to determine a false positive.
So I take the test again, and this time my results come back marked from the lab indeterminate. I'm faced with the decision, do I want to wait 6 weeks to test again or do it right away? I opted for right away. My results that time come back positive. Took it again, came back negative. I took it again, positive.
What happens if you're positive on one criteria but negative on another manufacturer's criteria? How do you decide who's infected and who's not?
You will use the most sensitive criterion.
In late December of 2007, I read about new legislation.
Do you hear that? That's crazy, right? 1 minute you got it, next minute you don't. Don't that sound like some Cavassier stuff? But you see how they, with the Cavassier, they kind of, they doctored it up. They was like, hey, look, well, it can be false negative because you can have it and get rid of it and still have signs and symptoms of it, and they still think you got it, right? They did everything they can do. They try to clear this one up. You know what I'm saying? Now, like I said, I ain't saying AIDS ain't real, but people might have been dying from something else other than AIDS.
Passed in New Jersey, calling for the mandatory testing of pregnant women or newborn infants, should the mother's status be unknown.
HIV mandatory testing, to me, is a no-brainer.
I'm very much opposed to the concept of mandatory testing of any population because the tests are scientifically shown to be unreliable and inaccurate.
You have no reason to fear this bill. And my hope is that eventually this will become a federal law so that every woman in this country would be tested.
But HIV testing isn't an absolutely precise science.
When I confronted my doctor about that, she said, we're way past Western blot now. We have the viral load test. But when you get the package insert for the viral load test, it says,
if you test positive, you are considered confirmed infected with HIV. But at the bottom of the page, in fine print, it states a person should have additional testing.
It does not allow you to tell a single person on this planet that they are HIV positive. And it's a scandal that this test continues to be used.
so again, I'm asking, where's the test? Where's the test that can confirm a diagnosis of HIV infection? And I can't find one.
I have the package insert from the manufacturer which they supplied me with. And under limitations of the test, it states that risk factors should be used in conjunction with the test. Has a person had sex? Have they used drugs? Have they had a blood transfusion? And then in conjunction with the test, not the test alone, but with the test, then you decide whether the person is positive or negative. Do the answers to these questions help aid in the diagnosis?
Of course they did.
Really?
Now, if I tell you that the test you took was lousy and didn't mean a thing, does that make any difference for everybody to hear?
It make a difference for me.
Yeah, I know.
How can we say that HIV is the cause of AIDS when we don't know, based on current tests, whether or not anybody diagnosed positive actually has HIV?
President Thabo Mbeki will officially open the AIDS conference tonight. Delegates here are hoping he will finally separate himself from the AIDS denialists.
We remain convinced of the need for us better to understand what would constitute a comprehensive response in a context such as ours, which is characterized by high levels of poverty and disease. As I listened and heard the whole story told about our own country, it seemed to me that we could not blame everything on a single virus.
I thought this man must be an idiot. Everyone in Africa is dying of AIDS. I know this because I read the New York Times. It's beyond doubt.
Rion Milan was hired by Rolling Stone to investigate and debunk President Mbeki's misguided ideas. Where to begin? The numbers.
My very first action, I opened Johannesburg's Yellow Pages. I thought that I could illustrate this with a scene that began in a coffin factory in Johannesburg, where workers are working overtime trying to create caskets for these mountains of people are dying of this condition. I discover that in the midst of what UNAIDS says is a plague, is that half of the coffin factories in Johannesburg have gone bankrupt.
In South Africa alone, it's about 1,000 people dying every day from AIDS.
If you're an advocacy agency and you perceive low numbers to be bad, your bias may be to accept higher numbers even if they're not scientifically sound.
I know Jim Chin quite well, and I was the chairman of the steering committee on epidemiology of the global program on AIDS in WHO when Jim Chin was in charge of epidemiologic estimates. And we could never get information how the WHO estimates were made then. So we were very critical in these days because we felt it was not based on enough evidence.
It's possible that he didn't read or he didn't understand them, but we did send information to anybody that wanted to know about the estimates because they were pretty transparent.
In an attempt to get to the bottom of the statistics debate, I've come to Geneva, Switzerland to look at the World Health Organization's official numbers. And what we found, there are no numbers, only assumptions and estimates.
How are the monies divvied out to states for AIDS prevention or AIDS treatment? How is government monies sent out to different states and communities?
The more AIDS you have, the more money you get.
Exactly.
The AIDS partners have a vested interest in maximizing and squeezing the data to get the worst possible scenario that they can out of it, because the worse the situation is, the more compelling their fundraising claims are.
When UNAIDS was created, about $250 million was spent on AIDS in poor countries. 10 years later, it's $10 billion. That's an unprecedented increase. Still not enough.
When that was created, the first thing Peter Piot said was that UNAIDS is an advocacy agency, pure and simple.
And this was my first objective when I came into this job, and that was put it on the political agenda.
He divested himself of all of the program aspects and the scientific aspects of AIDS.
This is not a scientific issue. This is a matter of politics.
Except one unit. He kept sort of the numbers unit.
We are really doing a major disservice to say it is not as bad as it looks like, because actually it is much worse.
1 month after my interview with Dr. Piot, the Indian government slashed their estimates by nearly 60%. Shortly thereafter, UNAIDS acknowledged they'd been overestimating global HIV statistics for more than a decade.
They've painted themselves into a corner, and now their house of numbers is falling apart.
America is leading the fight against disease, and I call on you to double our initial commitment to fighting HIV/AIDS by approving an additional $30 billion over the next 5 years.
Global corruption, misuse of statistics, in order to convince people that there's one hell of a problem out there, guys, and we've got to go and do something about it.
If you look at the real world, you know, how many people are infected, diagnosed to be infected, and eligible for treatment? There are very few compared to the number.
In April of 2008, Congress approved a $50 billion expenditure for AIDS treatment and prevention.
The vast majority of the world's population is not at any measurable risk of HIV infection.
No measurable risk. Growing up in the age of AIDS, I was taught there were 3 certainties in life: death, taxes, and contracting HIV from unprotected sex.
If you don't use a condom, there's a lot of chances that you can actually get the killer disease that is AIDS.
I did a study of the heterosexual transmission of HIV in California, and we recruited individuals who were infected with HIV. Then we recruited their sexual partners, and we looked at whether transmission, in fact, had occurred.
Padian runs a study. It's a 10-year study with the world's most virulent, terrifying sexually I mean, this thing jumps, off of penises into vaginas miles away. How many of them do you think after 10 years, with the world's most terrifying, virulent, sexually transmitted disease came up positive. Nobody. Nobody who was negative came up positive. Zero.
I think HIV is more difficult to transmit than than a lot of, probably most other sexually transmitted diseases. I mean, I think that's pretty widely known.
If I were to have unprotected sex with somebody who is HIV positive, how many acts would I have to engage in before I got the virus?
Just one. I assume one would be enough.
First act?
One is enough. Remarkably, HIV is a difficult infection to transmit.
This contradicts everything I was ever taught about the sexual transmission of HIV.
AIDS is the best example of what's really scary and alarming and dangerous about our culture right now, which is that it's a culture of PR.
All right, man, that's part 2. Stay tuned. Part 3 info will be coming soon. Thank you for coming through. Y'all have a good day. Remember, if you ain't getting knowledge, you ain't getting nothing. I crew this.